Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
There you go. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Horace Anderson. I'm the dean here at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law. And I want to just thank everyone for coming out for our inaugural Access to Justice panel and workshop. And I want to emphasize a few things about the title of this program. First of all, first one, inaugural. So kudos to PACE for taking this step to use our talents, and those are the talents of our students, our faculty, our staff, to address issues of access to justice, which I think everybody in this room understands goes beyond providing direct representation to clients, which we do quite a bit of here at our clinics, and goes to addressing more systemic issues, policy issues, and really sort of developing workable solutions about increasing access to information, increasing access to the physical locations where justice is supposed to be dispensed, and all of those things. We put together this program in order to be both an opportunity for discussion, that's the panel part, and then an opportunity to develop action, and that's the workshop part. And that's what we want our Access to Justice project to be about. We are going to do the thinking to develop the ideas that will increase access to justice, but we want to put them in a form that they can then be implemented. And if we can do that, if we can do that consistently, then I think this project will be a great success. So the person who is responsible both for our successes so far and who will carry us to the future is Elise Diamond, who is the director of our Public Interest Law Center. And that's the center that houses the Access to Justice project. So I just want to take a moment before I introduce her to thank Elise for all of the work she's done to take what I think was pretty much just an idea 2 years ago, and now has turned it into 2 courses and this program and a lot of initiatives that have started to be developed out in the legal community involving, as I said, our students, our faculty, and our staff. So without further ado, Elise Diamond.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to see all of you. It's really special to have, and I want to welcome, we have a bunch of folks joining us by Zoom, but it's so wonderful to be in a place and see your faces in person. We are just starting to get back to some of these a little bit larger in-person events. I do have some notes because I have a bunch of thank yous. So I am Elise Diamond. For anyone who doesn't know me, as Dean Anderson said, I direct the Public Interest Law Center and lead the Access to Justice project. And I am delighted to be here today. I want to thank Dean Anderson. He has been such an amazing supporter and partner in prioritizing access to justice and this project and programs like this one. I want to, of course, thank my partners in putting today's program together. So Jason Mays, Hudson Valley Justice Center's litigation director, as well as the executive director of Hudson Valley Justice Center, Virginia Folkrod, who's also a PACE Law alum and is joining us, I believe, by Zoom today. I want to thank all of our amazing panelists who are joining us today. So Professor Andrew Scher. Also, we have Managing Director of the Safety Net Project at Urban Justice Center, Marika Diaz. We have Director of Litigation at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, Marcy Kobach. Thank you for taking the time out of your roles doing the actual direct client representation and advocacy work in our community to be here with us. And in particular, I want to thank Marilyn Martinez, our attendant panelist, for coming and sharing her story. It's so important that she be a part of this process. I also want to just welcome and send a special thank you to some other folks. We have a bunch of full-time and adjunct faculty joining us. I want to thank them. It's so important that they be a part of this conversation, and their presence at these events is so valuable. And the work, of course, that they're doing in their classes and their clinics and in their scholarship. Dennis Hanratty, who is the executive director of Mount Vernon Tenants, who's been a real partner to me in my classes and in this initiative this year. Thank you for joining us today. Also, to our alumni, our other colleagues at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley who are here to support their colleague, but also joining us today, and so many others. So really thank you for your participation. We can't do this kind of collaboration without all of you joining us in the conversation. So we welcome you and are so grateful to have you. Also a warm, of course, importantly, welcome to all the students joining us on Zoom and in person, to my Access to Justice seminar students who have to be here, but I appreciate your being here to be part of this conversation and for your participation this semester. Some of my Access to Justice Lab students are here. Thank you for being here as well, and for all the work that you have done this year, including in the realm of housing in the lab, creating an app that we hope might help low-income Westchester tenants in addressing habitability and recording habitability issues. We're continuing to work on that project and have a meeting tonight at 8 p.m. See you then. So a couple more words, and then I will just move us on. I wanted, the purpose of the Public Interest Law Center here at the law school is to support our students who are interested in exploring public service legal opportunities and careers, of course. And we do really great job. I mean, our students, I don't know if folks know this, and this is fully unofficial, but it is often more than a third of our graduating class that goes into public service jobs. That's true for this last graduating class as well. That's a really large number. So our students are interested in pursuing careers in the public sector and are doing so. And we're really proud of that. But we know that even with that and with the work of the incredible legal services folks who are here in our community, that so many legal needs go unmet, both in housing and all kinds of other civil legal services. So we need all hands on deck, and the law school needs to be an active participant in closing those gaps. And so we have shared our commitment to ensuring that our students, faculty, and staff will use our training and resources and energy to try to impact change and help close those gaps. And this program is one of those efforts. I'll just say, to me, the purpose of today's program was encapsulated. My students know I really like some podcasts. I talk about them a lot. In a recent podcast I was listening to, a guest mentioned a quote, reminded me of a quote, and I will paraphrase it. It's a quote by Plato, and he said, "What a country honors, it cultivates." And I think that's true of an institution as well as in a profession as well. We speak to wanting to honor community engagement, addressing gaps in access to justice, using our resources and energy that way. And I think if we can live that, live that value, then we will cultivate that in the amazing students that spend 3 and 4 years with us and ultimately join the profession. So I think this is an effort to do that. Lastly, I just want to share the kind of plan for the program. We're going to listen to this amazing panel. And then over a continued lunch, we're going to ask that you engage with us in a conversation about ways that we can, as a law school community, use scholarship, collaboration through pro bono, and all of our tools to engage in both improving and addressing housing access as well as other civil legal access issues. And as housing intersects with so many other, or really every other, civil legal need, whether it's environmental justice, immigration justice, criminal justice, and so forth. So we have some discussion guides on the table you're welcome to take. We're interested in your ideas, as Dean Anderson said, to take action steps to go forward and not just leave the conversation today, but to continue that conversation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Jason Mays.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason. I thought I would start out by kind of setting the table for our discussion by just asking a quick question. How many people are familiar with the Tenant Safe Harbor Act? A few people that I expect to be familiar with it. But so this is a law that was passed in June of 2020, and it says, the important part of it says, no court shall issue a warrant of eviction or judgment of possession against the residential tenant or other lawful occupant that has suffered a financial hardship during the COVID-19 covered period for the non-payment of rent that accrues or becomes due during the COVID-19 covered period. So what does that mean? That means a person who couldn't pay rent during the pandemic shouldn't be evicted for not paying rent if they suffered a financial hardship. The landlord gets a judgment against them, a money judgment, but they shouldn't lose their homes, right? So that's a huge defense. But we're here, and not many people know about this. Surely not a lot of tenants know about this. And the year before that, there was a law called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act that extended notice periods for certain kinds of evictions, limited security deposits, imposed financial penalties for illegal evictions, terminated vacancy increases, and locked in preferential rents in regulated apartments, among other things, right? So there are all of these laws that were passed that expanded tenants' rights recently, but how do the tenants assert them? If there's a defense that a tenant has that can only be identified and asserted by an attorney, only an attorney can gather the evidence and present it to the court in a submissible way. That defense doesn't really protect the tenant very much, right? So we're here talking about how we all know in certain contexts, in the criminal context, a criminal defendant is entitled to an attorney when their liberty is at stake. That's a constitutional right. In New York, if you were in a family proceeding and your custody over your child is at stake, you have a right to an attorney, even if you can't afford one. But eviction proceedings are not yet in that category of things for which a person is entitled to an attorney. And that's what we're here to talk about, except in New York City. That's right. So, everyone here has a lot of experience advocating for right to counsel. I was going to give an introduction to everyone, but I just checked the flyer for this on the website, and everyone's listed there, so you can see their websites, but their bios there. But I think I would like to start off by talking to someone who's experienced landlord-tenant court firsthand from a non-attorney standpoint, right? So because most of the people in landlord-tenant court outside of the city, that's what they experience. So Ms. Martinez, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience and how interacting with an attorney or how being in landlord-tenant court prior to having an attorney, just telling us a little bit about your experience there.
Good afternoon. My name is Marilyn Martinez. My housing court experience was nerve-wracking. I didn't have a lawyer to represent me. I was working part-time. I'm a caregiver. I was still paying my rent through COVID. I had 2 surgeries and still paying my rent. So I had an eviction. So when I went to the court, it was very nerve-wracking. Like I said, I didn't have a lawyer to represent me. I did everything on my own. And then the judge told me that I can go to Hudson Valley and find representation. So I called the Hudson Valley and I got someone to represent me. Her name was Michelle. I don't remember her last name. But due to COVID and she was pregnant, so she turned over my case to Janani. And she's done an awesome job. Hudson Valley, I owe Hudson Valley my life right now. If it wasn't for Hudson Valley, I'll be homeless. If it wasn't for Hudson Valley, pretty much I lost everything. But in court, I did win. My first case was an eviction. Due to all my payments, when Janani took over, I had all my proofs and evidence. So I won that case. Then I had a different case. It was a withhold over. I already had left the apartment. I didn't owe anything. So I won that as well. Then my third one was a huge one, which was with Section 8. My landlady took some mail from me, which is to me is federal. You don't take nobody's mail. So just because of that letter, they took away my Section 8. I have a special need. I have asthmatics. And going through that, it was a nightmare. It was a very bad nightmare. But Janani, she stuck with it. We got all our evidence together and we beat Section 8 and they reinstated my Section 8 again. This week, inspection came to my apartment, finally passed. So I'm just waiting to see what's my share. And like I said, if it wasn't for that, I'll be homeless as of now. And due to that, I'm working. So I got able to do my taxes and I relocated. I spent $10,000 just to relocate, and real estate fees are very expensive. So is rent. And thank God I moved on and just waiting now for my Section 8 to come through. I know what's my share. Like I said, I will be homeless if I didn't have anything like my job, if I didn't have my taxes to do, if I didn't have Janani to help me. She was more like my backbone. I owe that woman everything as of now. And it was a horrible experience, but at the end, we stuck through it and we won every case. And I'm very grateful to Hudson Valley.
That's great. It's good to hear. So I was wondering if you folks could tell us what is the state of evictions like in New York right now? There's probably, cases backed up. How many cases do we see before the pandemic, during, and after? What do we think?
Maybe I can start with New York City and then hand it over. Yeah. So I guess can you hear me? Yeah. Right. Hey everyone, it's great to be here. Good to see you all. This is great. Evictions in New York City right now. So, it's like a constantly shifting terrain, right? And I think that's probably true outside of New York City as well. And obviously the pandemic had a devastating impact economically for folks. And so, before the pandemic, there were already hundreds and hundreds of thousands of eviction cases brought every year in New York City. And that really was part of what prompted the struggle for right to counsel, and also for the legislation that Jason mentioned, the HSTPA. And that kind of shifted a little bit how landlords used evictions and used housing court, because they really weaponized housing court and made it a place that was a site of, gentrification, right, and displacement, and a way to kind of get rid of tenants, particularly low-income tenants of color, right, Black and brown folks from neighborhoods where they saw sort of gentrifying potential. And so evictions are still used in that way, but the numbers of evictions are really, at this moment in time, very steadily escalating in a way that is really scary. And housing courts built up a backlog of cases through the pandemic where tenants fought for, moratoria and won. And now we're seeing sort of the gates opening, right? And all of those folks who couldn't afford to pay their rent because they lost their job, or they lost a family member, or they were in hospital with COVID themselves, all of those situations are now coming, those chickens are now coming home to roost. And we're now seeing those cases really building up in a big way. And we don't know how far this is going to go, right? We don't really know exactly the magnitude of the impact that COVID has had, on folks financially and their ability to pay rent or not pay rent. But what we do know is that we're seeing massively escalating rents, which is what Madeline was talking about, brokers charging tremendous fees, and landlords having a real desire to get rid of folks who are paying low rents and be able to charge much more than they're charging for those apartments, right? And so I think we anticipate huge numbers of evictions as a result.
And I can speak to the situation outside of New York City, including in Westchester, which we cover at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley with 4 offices, and we go as far up as Kingston. And it is the rising tide. I think there's a myth, right? We've been beating back this myth that housing courts were just closed, la-di-da, nobody was getting evicted during the pandemic, which was not true. There were, various provisions. It was a constantly shifting landscape for quite some time. It was like a full-time job to keep track of what was in effect on a particular day with respect to evictions. So then, of course, right, the weaponization of landlord-tenant court was like a weaponization of the COVID protections, various sneaky arguments to try to say, no, this person can be evicted because of this, because of that. And meanwhile, the cases were, building up. People were not getting physically evicted as fast as they had been before the pandemic, but the cases were still active. Tenants' attorneys were still having to go in and vigorously argue cases of first impression on an almost daily basis, if you can imagine that. Outside in a town or a village, so like Greenberg as opposed to White Plains, the judge does not have to be an attorney. So in addition to making an argument about, maybe preemption, maybe when it comes to Section 8 federal law versus state law, doing that to a layperson, Can you imagine that? Thanksgiving, you try to, explain field preemption to your aunts and uncles. But you also have, you have maybe inaccurate conceptions of what the various COVID protections meant and how they applied. And so those arguments to make as well. So it's been an incredibly challenging time. And now, yes, the gates, have been widening. And so the numbers are rising. So the courts were open, but there were certain measures like staggering cases. So instead of saying, everybody come here at 9:30 and you get lined up in the hallway and the landlord's attorneys, here, sign this, you have to sign this, you're going to lose your case. You have to agree to this, you're going to lose your case. They did for safety reasons, not justice reasons. Staggered cases, had fewer appearances on any given day, and that's really gone out the window. And so I look at numbers on these, and they're scheduling it such as that if you average it out, person could have as few as 4 minutes in front of the judge. So you're an unrepresented individual. The judge does not have time for you just because of the calendar that's in front of the judge that they have to get through that morning. And you have a complicated defense that you're trying to explain. So it's really disheartening, the state of evictions outside of New York City.
And do we have some idea of the number of cases that are generally filed like before the pandemic, and how many cases have been filed and are pending right now? I mean, I have some of that information. So in 2019, according to the court's website, there were 262,000 cases filed. So that's the number of people that are facing eviction prior to the pandemic. There were not nearly as many cases filed during the pandemic, but we can only assume that even more people were falling behind in rent during that time. So we assume there would be more cases that would be filed. So all of those cases that would have been filed have not, a lot of them haven't made it to court yet. Some of them have. There are like 250,000 pending cases, I believe, right now in the state's court system. So it's we're talking about huge numbers. I mean, and each of those numbers is potentially a family, right? So we mentioned that in New York City, there was a city law that requires or that grants tenants a right to counsel. And, you folks were instrumental in making that happen. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that movement? And
so I'll give a little bit of background and then turn it over to Marika to talk about how it's working right now. The idea that there should be a right to counsel for tenants who face eviction has been kicking around for more than a half a century. When the Supreme Court decided Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963, I think there was a kind of sense of expectation that our system of justice was actually moving away from pay to play and towards the notion that people should really have meaningful access to justice regardless of their income. Didn't quite play out that way. The kind of phrase civil Gideon kind of came into fashion, and there have been efforts in other areas around the country. I wrote a law review article about why there needed to be a right to counsel for tenants in the mid 80s, and actually ended up litigating the question up to the New York State Court of Appeals. Nowhere else in the country established a right to counsel for tenants. After Gideon, New York, and then eventually many of the other states established a right to counsel in child custody proceedings. In New York, it was a case that went to the Court of Appeals in '72 called Matter of Ellaby. But we live in a country where almost half the states don't even provide a right to counsel for parents who are losing custody, sometimes parental rights of their children. And in fact, in the early 80s, the Supreme Court, Lassiter versus Department of Social Services in South Carolina, said there's no automatic right to counsel, even if your parental rights are being terminated. So the law, certainly on the constitutional law on the federal level, is not good. There were in New York City efforts over, the years to try to push for either a legislative remedy, litigation remedy to win the right to counsel. And one little factoid that, people don't tend to know is that the New York Civil CPLR, the Civil Practice Law and Rules, Article 11, actually allows courts to assign counsel in any case if they feel that the litigant can't afford counsel and needs counsel. Never, ever used that provision, but it's there. Take a look at Article 11. But the right to counsel for tenants, the movement for the right to counsel really, really got traction in 2014 when a community organization in the South Bronx called CASA, Community Action for Safe Apartments, did a study of Bronx Housing Court, tenant-run study. So the tenants were the observers and went in and critiqued what was going on in court, came up with a number of recommendations. Among them was that there should be a right to counsel for tenants. This whole system made no sense at all, that people were being pushed through without really understanding what their rights are, not having anybody to represent them. And they really led a grassroots campaign, the development of, that's when I got involved in this round as well. And, a real snowballing coalition, all the tenant organizations in the city, pretty much tenants' rights organizations, and at one point clergy and folks from the labor movement. And it just kept growing. We had two champions in the city council that had really latched onto this idea. It didn't hurt them at all in their careers because they each became borough presidents in the last election. One, Vanessa Gibson in the Bronx and Mark Levine in Brooklyn. And between 2014 and 2017, this movement really grew. And ultimately, the mayor was kind of resistant. The speaker of the city council was resistant, but the pressure kept up. And in 2017, when de Blasio was announcing that he was going to run for re-election, he said, I'm in support. And that broke the logjam, and the legislation passed that summer. And actually now I've heard him interviewed a couple of times since he left office, and he takes credit for the right to counsel as being one of his major accomplishments during his term as mayor, which is interesting because he really needed to be pushed to do the right thing. And I will let Marika pick it up there because the law passed in 2017, but now going from a concept, a piece of legislation to a reality and making it happen is what we have been dealing with over the last few years. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just speak briefly about it. So prior to the right to counsel in New York City, about, I think it was like loosely 95% of tenants didn't have lawyers, and loosely the same number of landlords did have lawyers, right? So you can imagine like the power imbalance, and it really truly was part of how landlords were able to weaponize housing court and use it as a tool for gentrification, for increasing their profits, all the things that landlords kind of want to do, right? And so, that required, so when the law passed, there were a few of us involved in kind of providing legal support for the campaign, but I think most lawyers didn't really think the law was going to pass. And I didn't really, to be honest, even from the inner circle, didn't really think we were going to win that quickly.
And there were lawyers who didn't want it to pass.
And then there were lawyers who didn't want it to pass, right? Who preferred to pick and choose their cases and so forth. And so it was a really big shift, and it required a shift to the sort of legal services culture. It shifted the culture in the courthouses. It shifted what was going on. We went from a situation where I would show up at court and have a little, count on two hands, all the tenant attorneys, and the rest was landlord attorneys, to being a place where tenant attorneys became a real force, right? And that also really shifted, one of the things that's most striking about housing court, I think pretty much anywhere, right, is probably that if you haven't been to housing court, when you walk into housing court, everything about how this place functions, if if 95% of tenants don't have lawyers, the whole place is crafted around an understanding that half of the litigants are not going to be represented, right? And so it affects like how judges do cases, how many cases end up on the calendar, how much time you think you need for a case, right? 4 minutes is okay when the tenant doesn't know anything about their rights, right? And you're just rubber stamping an eviction. 4 minutes works for that. 4 minutes doesn't work when both sides of the bar table want to have an argument about something, right? So it really impacts the whole thing. And it's also a space that's like entirely racialized and gendered, right? So like if we walk into a space and on one side of the bar table in the courtroom, it's white, right? And mostly white men. And on the other side, it's mostly black and brown women, women of color, really, right? Oftentimes single mothers and so forth. It's like entirely, and class, right, plays a huge role in what's going on in that space, right? And so all of that stuff, like when you give everyone a lawyer, things start to shift, right? You start to shift, and who's being sued is not shifting, right? It's still black and brown women, right? But suddenly they have lawyers. Right. So it kind of changes the dynamic of what's going on. Right. And then honestly, for all of you all who are thinking about becoming lawyers, for us, like women of color who are lawyers, it shifted it for us too. Right. Like we used to walk into a space where all of our adversaries were white men, and they still mostly are. But the stuff that what we used to experience in that space and absorb and kind of find ways to deal with by, kind of adapting our practice, right, to deal with the racism and the sexism and everything, suddenly we're a force, right? And this is something like I really give credit to all of the sort of the younger lawyers, kind of the newer lawyers coming into the field, going like, we're not going to take that anymore. That's not okay, right? Like that kind of sexism and racism towards the tenant bar that was part of landlord strategy, right, and part of how landlords were winning. So it really has like changed a lot of what's going in the courts, but also required a massive ramp up of we went from practices where you had 3 attorneys to 100 attorneys, right? And that's like a big shift. That's like a whole lot of office space and computers and, training and like all the different things you got to do to shift to that scale. And so that's been something that, for 5 years, we've been sort of making those moves. And the pandemic kind of comes along and is a real kind of interruption and kind of has shifted a lot of how we're doing the work. But, we're still we're just now hitting that point in New York City where we're at full implementation. We couldn't do it overnight. It was not going to be possible. And so it was a 5-year phase in and, we're at that 5-year point right now. Yeah.
And so by phasing in, you probably learned some things about how it affected the certain zip codes in which there was a right of counsel, whether it had an impact on the filings, the speed of the case, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Like definitely landlords knew, right? Like if you're a landlord and you're going to file, you're using housing court as a weapon to kind of evict tenants because you want to gentrify your building. If 9 out of 10 of the tenants don't have lawyers and are just probably going to sign their rights away or not know better, right, that they shouldn't be evicted, it's not a bad strategy for your business, right, to bring 100 lawsuits. Some of them can be frivolous. Most of them can be frivolous. Doesn't matter, right? Because most of the tenants aren't going to have lawyers anyway. So when you suddenly know all the tenants are going to have lawyers, it shifts, right? You have to shift your business calculus. Your business model has to change. So that really was like a very immediate impact that we saw. Suddenly landlords can't just file a whole bunch of frivolous cases, and we phased in by zip. So we sort of saw the changes in particular zip codes where we were phasing it in. And we saw that 84% of tenants who had lawyers were able to stay in their homes. Right. So really we saw those kinds of changes in landlord behavior and not just in court. Right. And I think that's the thing that folks should always understand about a right to counsel is it's not just about what goes on in that courthouse. It's about what happens when a tenant knows they have a right to an attorney in the courthouse, how that impacts their behavior and their sense of their rights and their ability to assert their rights when they're at home. Right. Like when you call to get repairs done, are you worried they're going to try and evict you? Okay, see you in court because I know I'm going to have a lawyer, right? Versus, oh, I should not make that call, right? I'm going to put up with the lack of hot water. Or I'm going to put up with the mold or put up with the rats, right? And so really it really was not just a change inside the courts, but also a real shift in a tenant's ability to organize and assert their rights outside of the courts. And so I think that was, a huge part of the impact that people maybe don't always see. It's not always apparent.
Okay, so you're going to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add that a couple of, it's been remarkably successful, right? Marika said 84% of the tenants who've been represented stay in their homes. The numbers of filings have gone down about 20, this is before it was fully rolled out, gone down about 25%. The numbers of actual evictions performed by city marshals gone down by about a third. So it's really changing things. And what we did in New York City has really been inspiring for people around the country. And 3 states have now adopted the right to counsel for tenants: Maryland, Connecticut, and Washington State. 9 other cities have. And it's all just at the beginning, just beginning to be rolled out. But Cleveland was one of the early states, and their success rate is like 93% or something for the tenants they've been represented. So it's been so exciting to watch, frankly, to see that, you know, the scales are still way tipped in favor of the landlords, but that balance, you know, of the scales is at least shifting somewhat with real important consequences for people's lives and their ability to be with their kids and their health and all that.
How, you know, I think common perception is maybe that evictions are just, they're always about rent, and it's because a person can't pay rent. But so how would an attorney be able to, well, I mean, Ms. Martinez told us about her situation and that wasn't about rent, but.
I actually, the reason I ended up in court with an eviction was because I refused to tolerate me paying full rent and have rain coming down in my kitchen every time it rained. I was infested with rodents. It was horrifying living in that condition. And when I brought it to the attention, that I guess she didn't want to do anything about it. So the easier way for her to do is get her lawyer to serve me papers. And when I looked at the papers, I was like, okay. So then I started looking at all my receipts. I said, okay, this rent is fully paid. I have my evidence. But then her lawyer throws me with a fee. And not only with my rent, but then they throw me with another fee for lawyer's fee. And I was like, what is this? This is, you know, outrageous. And that's how I ended up in the court. And I was like, this is you know, uncalled for, because if I'm paying rent, you're the landlord, you're supposed to repair. You know, that's not part of me. I'll tell you what's going on. You come, you look at it, and you take care of it. But in her situation, she took it the other way. She just hired a lawyer and wanted to evict me. And at the end of the day, she lost, and everything she tried to throw at me, she lost. Thank God to the Hudson Valley team, like I said, because if it wasn't for them, I would be homeless right now.
Just to maybe piggyback on that a little bit. So, you know, these housing court proceedings, they're called summary proceedings. What does that mean? You know, you've heard probably a lot about discovery, right? That's a big process. The facts underlying a case, the information that one side has to be able to prove their case, somebody gets to look at, and you don't get that in a summary proceeding. It's summary, it's accelerated. However, the rules of evidence apply. So if somebody has a repair issue and they want to fight about that in housing court, they need to know how to lay foundation for a picture, subpoena the building department, so on and so forth. Habitability issues are a huge part of the housing crisis and the lack of justice for tenants and people in New York State. There is a special court part in New York City, which helps somewhat, which we don't have outside of New York City. So where sometimes even also, you know, we need to bring like a case against a building department because there's that enforcement aspect of it. It can be incredibly complicated, but it's a simple concept. You're charging somebody money to live somewhere, fix the roof, keep the heat on. But it takes a lawyer to get that done.
Yeah, and in my case, really brief, and in my case, I took it to the Section 8. I told Section 8 that it was leaking in my apartment. They were supposed to send an inspector. No one showed up because there was lack of an inspection because of COVID. I understood that. But at least one time somebody could come, because I'm living in, you know, it's raining in my apartment. So I'm like, somebody has to come out here. No one showed up. No one. So then I took it to the next level. I went to the building department. I made it a report on them as well, you know, to come see. No one showed up as well. And this was months and months and months. And all I get is a paper, oh, you're getting evicted. That's not how you do things. That's not how it works, especially when you pay, when your rent is fully paid.
So can I pick up on something that Marcy mentioned? I hope the law students appreciate the difference between summary proceedings and regular civil litigation. And I just very briefly, the history, summary proceedings have been around since the early part of the 19th century, in some states even earlier, and they were enacted into law at a time, well, first we didn't really have the Industrial Revolution or the cities as we know them, but it was also a time when, you know, who could vote in the early part of the 19th century? You had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to own property, right? And so that's who voted, and that's who held office, and that's who passed laws saying, well, we don't really want to have to go through regular civil process. If we want somebody out, we want it to be swift, and we want the result to be eviction, and we want to be able to get that judgment as quickly as possible. That's the history, and that's what needs to be challenged. Not, you know, having counsel is only part of the tipping the scales back, right? We also need to look at the whole process and say, wait a second, you know. And as Marika was talking about, you know, landlord-tenant relations have become racialized. You know, actually, the early part, probably, you know, Black people were held in bondage. They weren't tenants; they were enslaved, right? But now there really is a very, you know, strong racial dimension as to, you know, who gets evicted disproportionately, you know, who's a tenant because of all the deprivation of, you know, the ability to get home ownership. That's been part of our national kind of project for years and years. Anyway, I'm writing a law review article on this topic, so I could go on for it forever. But I think it is something really important. I want people to be thinking about, like, why do we even have summary proceedings for this? Right?
I mean, I guess you could ask the question, like, why evictions, right? Like, why is eviction the solution that is on the table when somebody can't pay rent, right? And you know, and so I think, and it's an important question, right? Because I think, you know, one of the things, at least in the Right to Counsel Coalition, you know, when tenants fought for the right to counsel, they were really fighting. They didn't really think that, like, having lawyers was going to solve the problems of displacement, gentrification, housing injustice, you know, repairs issues, landlord harassment, predatory behavior, etc. But what they knew was that they needed to shift what was going on in housing court, right? Because the tenants were losing big time, right? And that was part of being able to stay, like, to be able to fight for other things was being able to stay, right? You can't really fight for justice in your city if you're not there, right? If you're getting pushed out. And so that was a big part of things. And so really, you know, what the Right to Counsel enabled us to do was to start a conversation around, you know, fighting back against evictions, period, right? Like, really going, okay, well, why do we have evictions? Why is this? And, you know, one of the things that if you go into this practice, that you will start to very quickly realize is that it's not really about rent. And, you know, and it is about, like Marilyn, your story is like a really great example, right? Where a lot of times what it's about power, and it's about profit, right? Like, and rent, you know, we see landlords in New York City, there are like hundreds of thousands of vacant apartments in New York City. If it was about rent, all of those apartments would be rented out, right? Like, it's not just about rent, right? Like, sometimes it is a bit about rent, but really underlying all of that is who has the power, who has the ability to say what happens with land and what doesn't happen, who has the ability to include and exclude, right? And change the face of the city, right? Through gentrification and all these different things. And it is still a pay-to-play society, right? Like, that's what we live in right now. Like, you know, it's really kind of sad to say that the group of folks that are making laws and deciding laws, pretty much still that group, right? Like, that same group of folks, right? Like, maybe with some exceptions, you know, to make us all feel like it's possible to, you know, kind of transcend our class and our gender and our race. Yeah. Sure. But pretty much it's the same group of people. And they still want the same thing.
It's only where the power is.
Yeah,
right?
That's where the power is. And so, you know, like, I think that's like, so it's really important, like, when you go into these areas of practice, and you can have the same conversation if you decide you want to go into public defense, you know, be a public defender in criminal law, or if you want to go into family defense, and, like, you know, the folks who have a right to counsel when they're potentially losing their parental rights, who's mostly affected by that? Black families, right? And Black women in particular. So, you know, like, all of these things, you can have the same conversation. And so it's really important to look at, like, power dynamics and, you know, beyond kind of what you're seeing on the face of it, right? Like, which is rent, you know? Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's a good one.
So there's a bill that's sponsored by Senator May and Assemblymember Joyner, and it would expand the right to counsel throughout the state. 25 out of 63 senators are co-sponsors right now, and 30 out of 150 assembly members as of the last time I checked. So, it's still a ways to go, but it seems like maybe we're getting somewhere where it's nearly a possibility. Obviously, that would be amazing. And also, we're here at a law school, and if that bill passed, we would need the help from a lot of new attorneys. And so should we talk about maybe what kind of opportunities to do this kind of work there are, maybe what kind of career path people go through if they start out as legal services attorneys, or some people want to stick with it, some people go into private practice. I mean, you've probably seen tons of people go through various paths.
I think before you enter the course, everyone should be represented, because the landlords always have their lawyers there with them. We walk in blind. So I think every one of us, like tenants, should always be prepared and walking with a lawyer. So we need more lawyers. Please, we need more lawyers.
Yeah, and it is, it can be, incredibly rewarding. I think you've heard just about how different things are when there is somebody with legal training and somebody who can appeal. That's a big piece of it as well. Even though they try to stop us, we have our ways. But I think, absolutely, I think when I started about 9 years ago, it was about the most supportive working environment I had ever been a part of. It was immediately a team. Because we were in a fight for something absolutely critical. And I had absolutely everything I needed to get this done right. And people continuing to learn from one another. We all talk to each other constantly about theories, strategies, ideas. And, I totally agree, which shouldn't be summary proceedings, but because they are, you get litigation experience like nothing else. And also because of the volume, which shouldn't be what it is. People within 2 years could have done a couple of trials with, different types of laws underlying them or different legal theories involving the trial. Several kinds of motions, just about every procedural posture in, the CPLR and the procedural rules governing, housing cases. The legal tools that you learn to employ while doing this, you build them up quickly. And I've seen people become incredible litigators. In periods of time where you talk to somebody in private practice, they're like, yeah, I've never actually appeared in a courtroom.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It really is true. And I really encourage you all, the civil litigation experience you could get is remarkable. I think in housing practice, and it's maybe one of the unsung heroes over the years. I feel like a lot of the other practice areas maybe got a lot more glory than tenant lawyers have. But maybe that's shifting a little bit. And I think people maybe are starting to realize that it is like an amazing area of practice, and just the sort of the nobility and being able to fight alongside somebody for their home, I think is really something. There's just something in that is remarkable, right? And just such a privilege to be able to, like when you work with tenants, like, if you think about like what home means to you, right? Like it's not a small thing, right? To have a roof over your head. But it's not just about the roof over your head. It's about like your community and your family and where you go to work and, and where it's just like everything, right? Stability. And so it's everything. And so, so the ability to be part of a profession that is like standing alongside people in court and fighting that fight is like really remarkable. And so I really, encourage you all this, but, there's plenty of jobs there. You probably don't need me to tell you that. There's tons of jobs for housing attorneys right now because of the New York City right to counsel. And then when we pass, and it's like a when, not if, when we pass statewide right to counsel, there's going to be tons more, right? And it's going to be amazing. And so to be able to be part of that, it's also, you're part of building something too, right? Like when you sort of go into right to counsel work, when you're, it's just starting up, right? Like you're part of sort of a cohort of folks, a cadre of lawyers that are like building something that it hasn't come before, right? You know, and so you're really navigating a lot of stuff. And so if you're a person who's like wants to be part of building something, it's like this is a good pathway, right? Like it's a really good pathway. So yeah, I definitely encourage you all. There's going to be plenty of opportunities. And you know, you will probably know lots of people who aren't lawyers, right? Who maybe are like advocates and paralegals and want to advocate for people in public benefits. Like there's all of those opportunities too, social workers, right? All the things we need to do this work. So yeah, so it is amazing in that regard, but it's not for the faint of heart, right? Like it is, if you got to be ready to throw some fire, right? Like if you want to do this work, you got to be down to like really, you know, go to battle for tenants. And so, you know, I really like, I think, you know, when you're thinking about it, like if that's what you're down for, like I just, you know, very much encourage you all.
So let me just add, just because I think this is maybe the most important message that I think we're all on the same page about that we get across today is like, there are tons of jobs. There will be tons more jobs if or when we get the New York State legislation passed. And you can be in on really what is developing to be a whole new practice, right? And it's not just about having the warm bodies there to, you know, be part of a system that already exists. It's really about transforming the system, right? It's about being disruptive. You know, it's about having people who understand what that dynamic is that we've been talking about up here, and that you could have a hand in supporting people who are taking control over their own lives and really trying to change that dynamic. And we in academia in particular, but in legal academia, you know, we need to kind of change the culture so that people understand that, you know, people come into law school, oh, I want to do public interest work, you know, I'm going to get a job at the ACLU, or I'm, you know, I want to be a criminal defense lawyer. This is incredibly exciting, incredibly transformative work. And we somehow, you know, we need to transform the culture so that people come to law school because they want to be housing lawyers, because they want to be part of that fight. They want to work with people in communities. They want to really transform things. I think we can get there, but it's a project that we all need to kind of take a part in, that kind of real major cultural transformation in legal education.
Do you have any experience with housing clinics?
Yeah. You know, I started a housing rights clinic at New York Law School. Actually, my students and I wrote the bill that's now before the state legislature. You know, we have a role to play in supporting the, you know, training people to actually be housing lawyers, and then housing lawyers who are there to support change and to try to, you know, be there to support the people who are really advocating for their own rights. So yes, I do have that experience.
I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Is that right, Professor Diamond? Do we have any questions? Anyone have any questions for the panelists? Yes.
You were talking about the 4 minutes that on average people have to make their case. With more lawyers present, do you think even those who don't end up having a lawyer in housing court would be able to perhaps give themselves more time for that, for their piece of advocacy? So that they can have more time to fully flesh things out, even if they don't have a lawyer. Because if you have lawyers and you're pushing and saying we need more time, over time that would change the culture, how much time meeting, what type of case. So is that also something you're seeing the in-court culture as well as the out-court culture?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think also part of that, right, is you have more and more attorneys making more and more arguments. The judges go, oh, whoa, wait. I won't say what the rule is. It's kind of technical, but there is this rule which could totally change it's a procedural rule, could totally change the outcome of somebody's case, whether they're told they owe money or not. And the first few years that I was being a housing attorney, my colleagues and I brought it up. We never saw the judges do it unless we really pushed them to. And now, as a matter of course, okay, I'm flipping through the file, looking, did they follow that rule? Did they not? Right. So those kinds of changes you really do see.
And I think also in New York City, what we've seen is that, when right to counsel came into play, judges were like a key kind of group of folks where I think it's fair to say it kind of loosely broke into two camps, right? There were the folks that went, the judges that went, oh, you know, I'm a judge because I want to be a judge. And now I have two attorneys in front of me on most of my cases. This is great. I get to be a judge. I get to write decisions. I get to like really consider the law. This is awesome. And then you had the judges that were kind of like, hold on a second. Now, rather than rubber stamping evictions, you know, I actually have to read motions, read memoranda of law, you know, understand the law, and I have to actually decide on like actual legal stuff, right? Like that whole thing where there's a whole bunch of village courts where there are judges that are not deciding these cases who are not lawyers. Like, I don't know that that's going to be sustainable when there's right to counsel, right? And nor should it be. Right, because there's going to be like serious legal argument being made on every single case. So you know, so you really saw those shifts. So then 4 minutes, like even the judges, right? So then it becomes a labor issue for them, right? Because it really does shift. You've got to sort of think about these places in an ecosystem where every little change you make makes other changes, right? And so, you know, then it becomes an issue for a judge. It's like, well, hold on a second, I need to like write actual legal decisions on what, my 90 case docket for the day? I can't do that. I can't do that and work, you know, my job and have my weekends or whatever, like, you know. And so then everything changes, right? And so then your 4 minutes can't be 4 minutes anymore. Yeah.
One little factor, the federal courts handle, all the federal district courts handle about the same number of cases as the New York City Housing Court. And the New York City Housing Court has 50 judges and the federal district courts have 1,200. So process that, right?
That comment sort of gets at my question, but there's at one point a discussion about the case moving from summary proceedings to actually full-on civil litigation. How would the courts be able to maintain all caseload and we're seeing that all?
Yeah, the question was how could the courts possibly keep up with the cases when everybody has representation, or if we got rid of the summary process entirely? Well, they couldn't. They'd have to. They would. I mean, frankly, they would accommodate. They would have to change. You know, the whole system would be disrupted, and maybe we take over those federal court buildings with all the marble and stuff. And that's where, you know, poor people's or low-income people's issues get litigated with counsel on both sides. But it couldn't be sustained the way it is with the 50 judges. It's just not humanly possible. But it was all set up to be like that, right? You have 50 judges. You have expectation that nobody's going to have counsel who's a tenant in the process, and the judges have their quotas or their expectations about maintaining their processing cases. You know, we got to blow that all up, frankly, and it needs to be really rethought.
Funding for legal services and housing, is it often have to be on pro bono basis? Are the lawyers adequately compensated by the city? What's the situation?
That's a great question. I could talk about it in the right to counsel context, and you know, basically, so one of the things that preceded the right to counsel law in New York City was the formation of an Office of Civil Justice. And it was a sort of a law that was passed a little bit as a precursor. But it basically created an office that would administer civil legal services contracts, right? And so, you know, all of the different not-for-profit civil legal services providers, and this is not just in New York City, you know, get their funding from a range of different sources, right? And so you know, when people talk about pro bono, they're not really talking about us, right? Because we get paid a salary to do the work where, you know, we obviously maybe have volunteers that work with us and we maybe work with pro bono, right? But the work that we're doing is funded. And so, you know, so in New York City, the right to counsel law sort of basically gave the responsibility of creating and implementing a right to counsel to that Office of Civil Justice. And so then they needed to, you know, a budget to do that. And they fund the different civil legal services organizations in the city to do that right to counsel work. And one of the things that we were very particular about in the New York City right to counsel law, and it's the same with the state one, is making sure that it specified that it was not for profit legal services providers that were going to do the right to counsel legal services, because we didn't want there to be a profit motive involved and at play in determining how those services got delivered. Right, we want it to be non-profit entities that weren't worried about making money, right? Because when you start worrying about making money, then it changes what the kind of services are that you deliver, right? You have maybe an incentive to do higher volume, less quality, etc., right? And so that's how the financial side of it works. You know, one of the things that has been a big battle and is I think always probably going to be a battle is kind of this question around how much resources do you need to do it, right? So, and I think that's really the kind of one of the fights that we're always engaged in, is trying to make the city realize and make the Office of Civil Justice realize that if you're going to do this right, you need like a much higher level of resources than we currently have, so that you have social workers and public benefits advocates, and so that attorneys can have caseloads that are really reasonable and allow for them to really vigorously litigate every case as it should be, and also be part of the tenant movement, right? And be in movement spaces and in the community and, you know, do the work right. So, you know, so that's like one of the ongoing struggles around kind of the resources for the initiative.
Should we say something about the studies about the cost? I mean, we think that as a matter of justice, people shouldn't be evicted from their homes without an attorney advising them, right? Like, so regardless of the cost, that's something that should happen. But as it happens, there have been studies that show that preventing evictions actually, making that investment in attorneys that stops evictions actually saves cities and states money, because there are significant offsets in those programs. People aren't going into shelters. The cost for shelters are outrageous. It's really shocking that oftentimes a person is evicted from a home where the rent is lower than what the city is paying for the shelter when that person goes into a family shelter. Yeah. Just thought we should throw that out there. I think that we're close to the end of our time, but
for everything that she's been using for 25 years, and a question for the PACE community about whether we would start a housing clinic that has conveniently stepped away, so I can't put it on. Of course, you know, these are things. What the next?
That's why I raised that point.
Yeah, in a minute we will say thank you and invite our panelists to come join the conversations at lunch. But I will say that, you know, part of the next sort of little bit before our students, everybody has to go to class for the next half hour. The idea is for us to engage in these kinds of conversations about what as a law school community we might be able to do to contribute. Of course, one of the things is hopefully educating our students to be interested in pursuing a career path in housing, but also even in terms of pro bono and scholarship and research and clinics and all of those things. So I would really ask you guys, you know, don't worry so much about funding or the limits, right? We don't love the expression out of the box, but when you're, you know, we have these forms, jot any ideas that you have for how as a law school community we might contribute. That's part of the point of our discussion, to really have some action steps that we can go forward with. And I'm obviously interested, before we break, on maybe what ideas just off the top you guys might have, beyond, of course, thinking about pursuing a career that way. I do know, in answer to one of the student questions, one of the things that I noticed that some of the course kids also were interested in clerkship is the New Jersey court system hired a whole bunch of landlord tenant specialists, sort of new grads who are all very up in the past year, last year's graduation, which I imagine was to support the increase in housing cases. That would be interesting. You know, there are avenues, right? Creative avenues for even getting help to the courts potentially, that also might create opportunities in creating law grads. So, any thoughts that you guys want to share?
I just want to say that I hope that at the top of everyone's list is looking to, if you live in New York, find out if your legislator is co-sponsoring the bill, and if not, calling them and asking them to.
There you go. Somebody write that down.
And then I guess one that, you know, comes to my mind is, you know, getting involved in tenant organizing and providing legal support and lending whatever skills and that you bring to tenant organizing efforts, right? Because when tenants are organized and are operating as a collective, they're much better able to fight back against both evictions, but also, bad housing conditions, rent hikes, like all the different things that tenants encounter. And so it's not just like that, what happens when you're facing an eviction. There's also everything about the landlord-tenant relationship that happens outside of housing court that, you could be a part of kind of supporting tenants on now, right? Like right this minute. And you have the benefit of expertise here and folks are involved in tenant associations. And so I think that's like a great thing to think about. And it's also great to think about, like, if you're a tenant, should you be starting a tenant association? Should you be getting organized with other tenants? I mean, part of the thing about this work is that it's a collective struggle, right? We're all in this together. And it's not just about sort of fighting for other people, but it's about fighting with each other, right? To kind of change the way our society is working. And so I think that's like, other things you could be thinking about.
And that tenant organizing piece, that's an important way to keep the spotlight on this issue. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. When the pandemic started and people who never, had occasion to think about evictions or housing instability, it started to become a part of the national conversation. That's so important, and it needs to stay that way.
Well, I guess I would just reiterate the point about changing the culture. And I think, a bit of every institution looking inward and saying, this is the wave of the future. I mean, we're doing, 3 states now, cities all over the country. There will be jobs and there will be a transformation going on. And the schools have a role to play. And maybe just thinking about, what kinds of instruction is going to prepare people for this work. And also, if anybody wants to make a TV show, I think it would be, like a Law and Order about housing, with Marika could star in it. I think culture, no, seriously, I mean, not really seriously, but culture changes when people understand, like, this is cool. This is something I could really see myself doing. And we don't really have that out there enough at this point. So maybe the TV show is the best idea. Yeah, I'm dating myself if I say TV show.
I've been doing this kind of work for about 100 years now. I've often wondered, how come it's never reached a real political level with so impactful so many people? But right now it is doing that. So I see major articles in the New York Times and stuff like that. It's all throughout the country. So I think, as you mentioned, this is a very appropriate time to get involved. I think there's a movement that's growing, and I think people can really play a role in their community. So I have to find out, first of all, who's doing stuff in your community? Is there a local housing? What are they doing? One of the problems I just thought was kind of limited to participation. Housing was so complicated. Dealing with all 4 levels of government, the municipal level, the county level, the state level, the federal level. And sometimes people just throw up their hands. Try to find out who in your community is doing stuff and try to get involved with that.
And not to shamelessly plug my own work, but I do have a 1,400-page treatise that I update every year on housing law. So there's a place to go for the information. So
Literally wrote the book on landlords.
Literally.
Anybody else? Great. Well, first, let me say just one more time, thank you so much. What an incredible panel, and just thank you so much for spending so much time with us today. And to thank before just some folks here, Rachel Silva and Mr. Weisgarber and Tony Solano, who helped with all of our setup. So I just wanted to acknowledge them. And so now I invite the panel to come have lunch, and I invite the students and all of our community guests to engage with one another, but also, I hope that you will take advantage of the paper on your table and share with us. We really do want to make this something that continues forward and that we have action steps and ideas that we can move forward. So
And Elise, how do you want us to do that? You want us each to go to just a different table or?
Okay, great.